Welcome again to today's program. After about a 30-minute overview of Russian President Vladimir Putin's misuse of history as an attempt to justify his unprovoked attack on Ukraine, Dr. Susan Smith-Peter will lead a discussion on how public historians can respond to the situation, both collectively and individually. Public historians need to play a key role in making sure that factual information reaches the public and that misinformation is effectively countered. Dr. Susan Smith-Peter is Professor of History and Director of the Advanced Certificate in Public History at the College of Staten Island, CUNY. She's published widely on Russia and Ukraine for more than 20 years, both for academic and general audiences. She received her PhD in Russian history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2001. Welcome, Susan, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I just want to thank everybody here at NCPH for giving me this opportunity to talk. I just think that it's really important for public historians, first off, to be aware of the specific history and also to bring our specific skills to bear on this question, because so much here is about how history is being used in the public. And that is something that academics are actually not very well trained to deal with, except for public historians. And so I think that public historians can play an absolutely crucial and incredibly important role in helping to get out information, helping to counter misinformation, and in general, just helping to get the public to understand what is really going on. So what I want to do is to just sort of jump into my presentation. So I'm going to share my screen, and you'll be able to see what I'm doing here. And I will just play it from the start. Okay, so obviously, we're all here for this, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How can public historians respond? So let's start with what we all know. On the 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. Very few people realized it was going to be a full-scale invasion. They invaded Ukraine from the north, east, and south. And of course, Russia is attempting to overthrow the legitimately elected government of Volodymyr Zelensky. Russia has committed a large number of war crimes. And what's especially relevant for us here is that in his speeches before the invasion, Putin focused almost exclusively on history. There was both the longer history and also the history of NATO. I'm going to be talking about the longer history here. And this is a war over history, and no one can remain neutral. And that's very important to understand, because there are things that are true, and then there are things that are just not true. And it's important to understand that. So this February 21st speech that Putin made about Ukrainian history, this is his real main justification for the war. We have this mix of outright lies and misinformation. And one of the responses that you get from scholars was to say, it's inaccurate, it's distorted. I mean, that's totally true. But it's insufficient. It's insufficient to just point out that these things are not true. A deeper question is, why are these things not true? And here I follow Yale historian Timothy Snyder's argument and is The Road to Unfreedom, that Putin's Russia is a state that desires the return of Soviet power in fascist form, okay? And, this was very controversial when it came out. Honestly, it should be less controversial now that we see what's going on. But I'm going to give some real detailed information about why Timothy Snyder is right here. And we can also see this in Putin's historical arguments, which I put scare quotes around because they are not really what we would consider arguments. Okay, so here we've got Ukraine. It's united territory as it was without the Russian annexation of Crimea and the breakaway republics in the east. So this is what it was before. I mean, Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe, tremendously productive agricultural land, a lot of wheat, there's a lot of all sorts of raw materials. And as we've all seen, the Ukrainians are absolutely devoted to their country and willing to lay down their lives in order to defend it, which was something that Putin was not expecting to deal with. And it is the largest country in Europe, you know, when we don't look at Russia. Okay, so this is a viral meme. It does provide a useful scale map of Russia and Ukraine, realize the scale of Ukrainian heroism. It is pretty enormous when you look at that. That is Ukraine there, that small bit. I mean, for Europe, it's large, but on the kind of continental scale of Russia, it's really quite small. Okay, so let's get into some of the details of what Putin does in his speech. He rejects the very existence of Ukrainian history and statehood. For him, Kievan Rus, this is early, you know, late 9th, mid 13th century, it for him was nothing other than a Russian state. It's the beginning of the Russian state. Now, Ukraine also claims Kievan Rus as the origin of their state. Honestly, neither of them are exactly the same as what Kievan Rus was, but if we can say that Russia was, you know, Russian history begins with Kievan Rus, no particular reason why we can't say Ukraine's does as well. You could say it began there and then it divided in two, or however you want to look at it, but certainly Putin's position is that only Russia can claim Kievan Rus, which for them is a sacred origin. It's as sacred for them as Lexington and Concord and the shot heard around the world and all of that is for us. So that is what is under contestation here. He ignores the Cossack states of the 16th to the 18th centuries. These Cossacks, they shifted between Muscovy/Russia, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He ignores the partition of Poland, means part of Ukraine went to the Habsburg Empire, where the Ukrainian language and culture flourished. Of course, the other part ended up with Russia. Right. So for Putin, Ukraine begins with Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Now, this is just completely false. I saw a lot of memes among my historian friends, Russian historian friends, where Lenin is just sitting at a desk and he's writing on some paper and it says, Lenin is inventing Ukraine, which is, you know, absurd. Ukrainian as a language begins to diverge from Russian, which was at that time Old Church Slavonic by the 13th century. Ukraine was independent between 1918 and 1920. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had to retake it by force, but that memory remained. And the Soviet Union had this sort of pseudo-federal structure. What that meant is enshrined, so to speak, in the Constitution was this idea that it was a federal state and that the different components of the state could actually leave the state. All right, and Putin was very upset that that was included in the structure of the state, because once it was there, it could actually be triggered and it could actually be used as part of the reason, as part of the mechanism to end the Soviet Union. Now, why was it pseudo-federal? Because Ukraine and Georgia demanded that structure, not because, as Putin said, Lenin gave it as a gift. Sort of like when you really care, give the gift of Ukraine, right? It's just all, it's absurd. Putin entirely ignores the Holodomor. So the Holodomor is the terror famine, which during Stalin's Soviet Union, this is the early 1930s, they deliberately increased grain requisitioning in Ukraine, leaving the people with nothing to eat. Around 3.9 million people died, mainly of starvation. You know, people were just dead on the street. There were piles of bodies. People died on stairs, you know, everywhere. They're just lying there dead. Raphael Lemkin, who you may know is the person who coined the term genocide, said in 1959 the Holodomor was a classic example. And after this, Ukrainian culture and language were suppressed, and Russian speakers were resettled there as a result. So this is very much a planned kind of terror famine that happened. Okay. Putin also blames Mikhail Gorbachev for the end of the USSR. This is also false. December 1st, 1991, Ukraine passed a referendum with more than 90% of the vote, and they decided to leave the USSR. And without the Ukraine, being there, the USSR didn't make a whole lot of sense. So, in other words, Gorbachev reacted to what was happening. He didn't create it. But for Putin, nobody has agency aside from Russian rulers, right? And certainly the Ukrainian people have no agency. And at the same time, he's complaining that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Germany, and the CIA have all led Ukrainians astray. Now, it's hard to lead people astray if they have no agency. So, that's part of the contradiction in his own retelling of things. Okay, so one of the key things that he says is that Ukrainian nationalism is the same as fascism. And unfortunately, these claims are circulating widely on social media in this country, but they're just false. Even the Azov battalion, a main talking point of Putin's, is militia. At one time it was neo-Nazi, but it isn't now. This is, obviously it's not good that they were neo-Nazis at some point, but this one battalion that has this troubled history is by no means evidence that Ukrainian nationalists are fascist. And at the same time, it's worth saying that Putin has sent in hundreds of mercenaries from the Wagner Group, which is a neo-Nazi organization of mercenaries, to kill Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's first Jewish president. Right, so that's important to understand. And I've been combating these claims a lot on social media, so they have been making the rounds without a doubt. So let's step back and talk about some of the origins of these ideas. Now, it's important to understand that Russia is kind of steeped. I mean, the elites of Russia are kind of steeped in this fascist milieu, which honestly is something that more Americans should know about, just as a starting point. But, so I'm not saying that absolutely no other people are making these kind of points, but Dgan is especially important because he's been obsessed with Ukraine for a long time, and he's been making arguments that other people have picked up. So in some ways, he's sort of like a entrepreneur having to do with Ukraine. That is to say, he has all these ideas, he floats all these ideas. Some of them are picked up by the state, some of them are picked up by Putin, others of them are not. But it is something that Dgan is indeed a very important person in this milieu. So let's go back to Timothy Snyder and the road to freedom. Dgan is one of the leading fascists. Dgan is one of the main protagonists in Snyder's book. So Dgan has been calling for the annexation of Ukraine since at least 1997. And in Dugan's Foundations of Geopolitics, he argues sea-based powers, US and UK, will inevitably go to war with land-based powers of Russia and others. And there's a lot of other stuff. There's a lot of occultism. There's a lot of mysticism, and a lot of really kind of disturbing things, as you can imagine. So the book also calls for Eastern Ukraine, Moldova, and other states to be forcibly reattached to South Russia. And this book has been taught in Russian military schools and the General Staff Academy since that time. So we've got a textbook here that is being the main source on this topic for generations of Russian officers. And that's very important to understand. And I have seen very little discussion about that. Okay, so let's look at the symbols of the National Bolshevik Party that was around between 1993 and 2007, of which Dgan was a founding member. I don't really have to explain to you what the originals are here. It's pretty obvious that there's a lot of copying of Nazi symbols here. And, so this is just part of it. I mean, Dgan has a whole kind of list of things that he likes that are connected to the Nazis. I don't have time to talk about all of that now, but even in his own writing, there's plenty there to show all sorts of links. And, you know, this makes it pretty plain in and of itself as well. Okay, now this is really important. I don't think anybody else has been showing this map. I found it just yesterday when I was doing my research. It's very important. This is from the 1997 book. This is a map of South Russia, which should serve as the basis for future geographical expansion of Russia to the south. Okay, so this should be worrying for anybody who knows that this is in a textbook that's been taught in military academies since 1997. Let's look at it more closely. Number one is the Balkans. Number two, Romania and Moldova, right? Luckily for Romania, it's part of NATO now. Three, Crimea and, you know, southeast Ukraine. And then we also have Central Asia, you know, Tibet and so on and so forth. So this is, of course, deeply troubling, deeply troubling. It is a, you know, an agenda for expansionism, an agenda that has been partly realized. Here we have this famous map, March 1st, Belarus President Lukashenko. Here he has this map, and mainly people talked about this map because it shows an invasion of Moldova. Right, there it is there. And a lot of people were making fun of Lukashenko for showing this map and giving away the plans. And as a result, Moldova is in talks for an accelerated entrance into the EU and all of that. And this kind of division, partitioning of Ukraine is something that Dgan had talked about for some time, although, you know, he had focused more on the eastern part of Ukraine. And if you remember over here, there's this freaky kind of inset. This is, I wanted to give you the bigger picture of Moldova. There's an inset of the United States over here, and here we have the inset of Western Europe. So there's a lot to worry about when it comes to this map. Okay. So let's look at Dgan. He's consistently pushed for the Russian annexation of Ukraine in his book, Ukraine, My War, which honestly is kind of a clue right there. Moscow, 2015, he states that the introduction of Russian troops into Ukraine is, quote, a necessary and inevitable step. He led a sort of fascist astroturfing in the breakaway republics by creating the Eurasian Youth Union. This is a fascist youth group. In 2006, it helped gather signatures for a referendum on the Donetsk Republic. And these are the people who, like Putin, said there was a genocide taking place against Russian speakers. That is just, you know, completely false. So let's compare these views of Ukraine. Dgan, March 2014 interview, and this has been, this was preserved in an interview on Skype, and it can be found here if you're interested. This is a totally fascinating article if you're interested in an accessible introduction to this question. So he said the Ukrainian state was illegitimate, the Ukrainian parliament is a Nazi junta, and peacekeeping forces should be deployed in southeastern Ukraine to, quote unquote, liberate them. So February 21st speech, Putin, Ukraine never had stable traditions of real statehood, and Ukrainian nationalism is described as aggressive Russophobia and neo-Nazism. 24th speech. On February 22nd, made a decision to carry out a special military operation. And as you know, anybody who uses the term war instead of special military operation can be thrown into jail. And the purpose is to protect these people who have been facing humiliation and genocide. And to this end, we'll seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Okay, this basically from a fascist power itself. So that is something where you can see the similarities there. And one of the things that is so terrifying and sad for me is that a lot of Americans believe these Russian lies. And one of the key questions is, you know, how can public historians help to make this information accessible and engaging for the public? And one idea I had is for a digital bibliography of Ukraine. We can talk about that later. But I also would like to think about what kind of things can we do in order to deal with the constant spread of misinformation, right? People are spreading this deliberate Russian disinformation for a variety of reasons. And, you know, is there something that we can do as people who have expertise on making history understandable to the public, which I have to admit the discipline of history itself is not really trained in and doesn't always really know how to do very well. You know, what is it that public history can do to help spread, at the very least, real information, you know, accurate information about Ukraine, right? I think that's an absolute, frankly, is an absolute moral imperative at this point to spread this accurate information. And then there's also the need to stand against the misinformation which is being spread by people as well. And my question basically is, what can we do together? Because I think that as public historians and hopefully some digital humanities people, that there's a lot of things that we can do. And if we can think about doing them together, I think that it will be a really seriously significant contribution to this whole debate and to this whole stage of world history that is unfolding. Thanks very much.